So normally I would speak freely, but I want to keep this in time. So I decided I'm going to actually read this, otherwise I'll go off in tangents constantly. So going to keep this simple. So I'm dealing really quickly, that's to introduce. I call this Western models of God and Indian concepts of the absolute. Kept absolute God a little bit vague. I'm using the example of Chaitanya from Gaudiya Vaishnavism. The reason I've chosen that one, we had the conference online recently and we were hearing different concepts from different parts of the world, Japan, from Africa. We've also heard from different parts of South America. And they're very, very different concepts to what we have in Western philosophy. So I chose this particular one, because I'm familiar with it, and secondly, because it kind of straddles a little bit between this kind of very unusual concept that you can't apply to Western concepts, and also you could possibly apply Western concept to it. So I thought I'd do this one as an example, just to give you an idea of how it might and might not work. Okay, so a moment. So the Concepts of God and Variety of Theisms in Indian Traditions project, of which this conference is a part, is among other things an attempt to approach Indian and underrepresented concepts of God more philosophically, and two, in connection with that, to encourage dialogue between religious studies and philosophy on such issues. The overarching question I am asking in this paper is connected with two, which is whether the characteristics of the Gaudiya Vaishnava founder and saint, Chaitanya, who is considered God by his tradition, the analysis of this particular concept being underrepresented, they normally go for a more Vedantic style, are consistent with a set of the more prevalent models of God used in philosophy or religion, or alternatively, whether this concept of Chaitanya would better warrant its own kind of analysis, sui generis, hybrid, or otherwise. I will not argue for one or the other of these options in such a short time. What I would like to show is where some of the compatibilities and the deficiencies of current models lie in assessing the concept of Chaitanya as God. I could list many more models, but because of time, I'll outline a couple as an indicator of the general issue. The next slide is not actually connected with my talk. Let's see if I can get it out. Nope, not working. There you go. But I thought I'd show you this because it's very complex. This is a map given from just the text I'm looking at of basically God at the top, there's Krishna's Swarup, there's Krishna as God for the tradition, and then all the different expansions and all these different avatars, incarnations, and then different types of avatars and so on and so forth. You end up with a very complex map there, which is very hard to map in the mind in a sense. So trying to find a simple way to kind of express this. So moving on. So the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, also known as Chaitanya Vaishnavism, is, as the name suggests, a branch of Vaishnavism, a major religion under the banner of Hinduism, focusing on the worship of God as Vishnu and his divine manifestations. Gaudiya Vaishnavism is rooted in a devotional worship of the deity Krishna, the dark-colored playful god of Bhagavad Purana and the warrior prince of Bhagavad Gita. Whereas other Vaishnava traditions regard Krishna a manifestation or incarnation of Vishnu, Gaudiyas consider Krishna the source of all manifestations, including Vishnu. So the more standard Vaishnava pantheon is flipped on this detail. Gaudiya Vaishnavism's origins are in Bengal, India, in the 15th and 16th century. They're specifically rooted in the teachings and ecstatic devotional practices of Sri Chaitanya. Not in that picture, I'll show you later. In terms of its theological focus, the tradition emerged within the broader context that was in the upsurge of bhakti or participatory devotion across ancient India. In respect to method, the tradition prioritizes love and surrender to a personal God over Vedic ritual and Upanishadic meditations and study, though it also considers itself the natural offspring of Vedic, Upanishadic, and Tantric traditions. For it assimilates and interprets these traditions' texts and practices to support its own understanding of Krishna Bhakti. The Gaudiya Vaishnava focus on Bhakti is centered on the divine loving relations of Radha and Krishna, on the right there. In fact, Radha literally comprises the divine love aspect, potency, or Shakti from among Krishna's unlimited Shaktis. So for Gaudiyas, Radha and Krishna cannot be separated. The tradition also emphasizes, controversially and even scandalously for other Orthodox Vaishnava traditions, that this relationship between Radha and Krishna is conjugal and parakiya. That means basically extramarital. This makes the greatest property of this loving relation in terms of its intensity. Other more orthodox traditions take the safer and alternatively consider Radha Krishna relationship to be svakya or marriage or marital. Let's see. Okay. So Sri Chaitanya was born in Navadvip, Bengal, in 1486 and kind of mystically disappeared in 1534 in Puri, Odisha nowadays. His life was marked by intense spiritual experiences, ecstatic displays of divine love, mostly in the mood of intense separation from Krishna, which was Radharani's mood, and a profound emphasis on congregational chanting of Krishna's names, called kirtan, as the primary means of experiencing God. Although Chaitanya is often referred to as a saint and spiritual preceptor for the tradition itself considers him to be non-different from Krishna. Moreover, he is regarded a combination of Radha and Krishna, which depending on opinion can mean either one, an ontological combination of the two divinities, however that may be conceived, or two, Krishna in the mood of Radha, who is specifically exhibiting the intense emotion of separation from the beloved. So there's slight differences in the way it's interpreted even within the tradition. Before we go into the attributes that are used to define Chaitanya as God, it should be noted that I'm limiting my primary source for this analysis to the first 4 chapters of the first book of Krishnadas Kaviraj's hagiography called of Chaitanya, which is titled Chaitanya Charitamrita. There's a couple of other hagiographies as well. I'm sticking with this one. It's more connected with the core of the tradition. I'll refer to this as CC, Chaitanya Charitamrita CC. These 4 chapters outline a theology of Chaitanya and Krishna. They offer both an exoteric or more Vedantic style explanation in regard to the tradition's concept of God, as well as a more esoteric explanation based on rasa. A simple translation, and the tradition's own corpus of writings known as Rasa Shastra. Simple translation of rasa being that of divine aesthetic relish, experienced through various human and divine relations. So rasa basically comprises a divine psychology. So Chaitanya Charitamrita primarily deals with Chaitanya as Krishna. These are some of the characteristics of Chaitanya as God, as expressed through the first 4 chapters of Chaitanya Charitamrita. I've offered some citations there, but I won't refer to them through here. So the CC primarily deals with Chaitanya as Krishna, not as a saint or what anything else. Krishnadas's arguments for Chaitanya's divinity in the text are achieved through references about Chaitanya himself, as well as through scriptural or shastric references to Krishna and to other divinities in the Gaudiya pantheon, such as Vishnu, Narayan, and so on and so forth, which are referred to in different texts. Hence, Chaitanya is asserted explicitly and through textual references as identical with Krishna or God, although Krishna and Chaitanya exhibit different bodies and, to a degree, different moods as well. Chaitanya is considered the combination of Radha Krishna. That's there. The 4th chapter of CC on rasa as a spiritual psychology outlines the internal reasons for this combination, namely that Chaitanya is Krishna who wanted to experience Radha's intense love for him. Right? This combination is also expressed ontologically as Shakti and Shaktiman, potency and potent. They're existing in a relation of identity and difference, or beta-beta, beta-a-beta. Ricardo, who will be speaking next, will present something on this beta-beta relation in terms of contradiction. So I'm going to leave that out. For the purposes here, I will leave the interpretation, this interpretation and this presentation open. All we need to commit to is the idea that Chaitanya as God contains complexities that might be problematic for the typical models of assessing concepts of God. Couple of other things I should mention. Chaitanya is highly personal. His interactions with other divinities and with people in general, especially his close companions, exhibit very human qualities. He manifests intense emotions and performs seemingly mundane acts, such as playing the role of a guest for lunch, or chanting and dancing to music with his close associates. In his early life, he was an academic who specialized in grammar. having no interest in spiritual life. This changed after he committed to a guru, where he started to exhibit more and more spontaneity in his pursuit of divine love and devotion, or prema bhakti, the participatory devotion of love. So very human. It's not like God is always the same. Very changeable in his life, very kind of human type life he went through. Chaitanya is often referred to as the embodiment of prema bhakti. Another one there. His life is a display of the ultimate aim and method for the tradition, a life of service, spiritual practices, and nurturing of spiritual relationships. Hence, his life was spent in the role of the best of devotees of Krishna. Towards the end of his life, he exhibited the intense mood of separation from Krishna more and more often, frequently isolating himself and externally seeming like a madman. In this sense, from the example given through his life, Chaitanya is also a teacher and a distributor of the purest form of prema bhakti. He is also considered a hidden avatar, also mentioned in the text. Very few, even during his time, knew him to be God. The exoteric explanation of his appearance in CC is that he descended to teach prema bhakti and to encourage a wayward humanity to chant Krishna's names as a means to liberation. His esoteric purpose was to experience the love of Radha, which also affected all who came in contact with him. So you get a general sense of what we're dealing with Chaitanya here. It's not a standard understanding of God, and even descriptions of him are not standard. As mentioned, I mentioned earlier, I will not analyze these characteristics of Chaitanya in isolation from the models typically used in philosophy of religion. However, I will need to limit the models I refer to due to time constraints. So I'll stick to two of the more standard ones, and their main characteristics, namely a selection of their characteristics, namely perfect being theism and panentheism. I considered, and I'm still considering, including some panpsychism, for Chaitanya literally means consciousness. But as I hope will become apparent in the following, the concept that Chaitanya is so personal and unique that I fear that panpsychism would be too constrained to one aspect of his being to properly capture the idea of what he is like insofar as he is God. So, give you a picture. Perfect being theism. Okay. Little background. Perfect being theism typically emphasizes the maximal greatness of what are considered divine perfections, which on a typical Abrahamic concept of God includes omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, deity, independence, necessity, and so on. This model is also often based on Anselm's approach that God is the being of which no greater can be conceived. Thus, God is represented through a complete set of perfections insofar as they are conceived as great making properties, which importantly should be compatible with each other and with other divine properties. However, determining these great making properties is a highly contextualized task that is inevitably married to a cultural outlook, often Abrahamic or Abrahamic adjacent. The question with regard to applying perfect being theology to Chaitanya as God therefore hinges on its translatability, which inevitably means there will be some loss. The question is whether the gains are worthwhile. So, on assessing a concept of God, using perfect being theism insofar as it applies to Chaitanya means first to identify the perfections and determine their relevance. So standard perfect being theism prioritizes the notion of an omni-God, namely God possessing the standard omnipotence and so on and so forth, among other great-making properties. Can these be applied to Chaitanya? There are several verses in the first 4 chapters of CC that describe either Chaitanya or Krishna, the latter in the sense that Krishna is Chaitanya, as possessing what could be construed as equivalent to omniproperties. These I've listed throughout here. You have, for instance, supreme greatness, which is kind of like a generic property in a sense of everything. You have references to mystery, mastery or possession of full strength, power, or possibilities, which could be linked to omnipotence. You have the source, Chaitanya is the source, shelter, or cause of everything, which also could be omnipotence as well. The controller of all living beings and the material and spiritual worlds, also possibly omnipotence. Full, perfect, or unobstructed knowledge, which seems to imply Trikaligya, knowledge of past, future, and present. Omniscience, possibly. All-knowing, again, omniscience. Benevolence, mercy, or providing well-being combined with the above two could imply omnibenevolence and self-manifesting or the independent origin of all, aseity, similarly purna, or the complete whole is also mentioned as well, ascetic. Are these perfections compatible? Right? If we consider each of Chaitanya's proposed perfections listed on the slide to be exhibited to the fullest extent possible, then we would have the same problems of consistency between them as we would with any other concept of God. For example, there's, for instance, the Odyssey, or how does an omnipotent being, there's also omnibenevolent, allow suffering in the world, that would apply. Also, another example of paradox, that if God is omnipotent, could he not create a situation where his knowledge is false? That creates two problems as well. If God cannot, it suggests a limit to his omnipotence. If he can, challenges the concept of strong omniscience and so on. Also, as fully complete omni-properties, they would clash with other properties of Chaitanya mentioned throughout the text. For example, those connected with his interrelations with the world. Right? In one instance, CC describes Chaitanya or Krishna in the all-encompassing manner, that is, with full 6 great making properties for wealth, beauty, strength, fame, detachment, and knowledge. But in other instances, he's depicted as interacting with the world. For example, in at least it's all the way through the Chaitanya Charitamrita, but at least in the first 4 chapters, it's even mentioned there. For example, it cites Bhagavad Gita, which acknowledges the Lord also engages with his devotees who have free will. As in fact, the whole of CC describes Chaitanya's interactions and affectations in the company of humans. This interplay between God and devotees, humans, raises questions about the balance between divine control and individual autonomy. So what about a maximal degree or maximal God thesis? One way to hedge away from the problems posed by positing Chaitanya as exhibiting omni-properties to the fullest extent is to first consider what it means to possess these properties to the highest possible degree, and then see if they can be weakened without violating God's status, so as to allow for their combinations while avoiding inconsistencies. This would be a weaker version of perfect being theism. So there's quick kind of like whatever dirty explanation of what the two versions are. We could appeal to Eugene Nagasawa's maximal God thesis to attempt to address the claim that the omni-properties do not necessarily have to be exhibited to the greatest degree, i.e. a version of weak PBT. God just needs to possess them to the greatest degree in comparison with the other entities, or God could instead possess the greatest combination of such properties, but not necessarily to the fullest degree. On the weaker perfect being theism account, if we assess the concept of Chaitanya as Krishna or as God, by attributing to him omnipotent properties that are not absolute or not to the fullest extent, it would seem that we have a fit at first. However, the concept of Chaitanya is far more complex than a mere assessment of omni-properties or attributes. Besides, the conception of Chaitanya in CC does not constitute a standard PBT concept of God. There are a number of inconsistencies between the omni-God concept of Chaitanya and its conception by Gaudiya Vaishnavas, like the author of CC, Krishna Das. These problems, to be true to the Gaudiya concept of God, we should assess whether in terms of even the weaker account of PBT, Chaitanya as omni-God is consistent with the tradition's other religious and philosophical beliefs. To keep this manageable, I'll ask whether PBT aligns with a sample of these beliefs and their implications, namely single examples of scriptural belief, traditional belief, and or personal experience of Chaitanya. So this summary what I'm going to say now. So scriptural consistency. So the example I will use here is the Gaudiya notion of divine impassibility, the idea that God is not affected by the world, which is related to aseity. The problem is that CC also includes passages, which there's a reference there to where it could be. The idea of impassibility is there. The problem is that CC also includes passages describing Chaitanya's experience in anger, compassion, and grief as a result of interactions with the world and its inhabitants. It is even brought up in the first 4 chapters dealing with the more general issues. That's the example there, but that's just the example in the first 4 chapters. There's many more examples throughout the CC as well. These divine emotional issues point to a need to reevaluate the notion of impassibility and whether it is even applicable to Gaudiya thought regarding Chaitanya. So traditional doctrine, Gaudiya Vaishnavism has its own theology, but it also assimilates a great deal from Vaishnavism in general, as well as for Vedanta, Yoga, Sankhya, the other darshanas, Tantra, most notably Pancharatra, among other traditions and texts. A big problem with this assimilation of texts, practices, and ideas resides in the interpretation of Krishna's status, and by extension, Chaitanya's divine status. Gaudiya considered the Bhagavad Purana verse, Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, effectively a Mahavakya, a Shastric scriptural statement on which all other Shastric statements can be interpreted. This verse establishes Krishna as the original God across all texts. So every other text is interpreted according to that verse. Right? This notion of Krishna as origin of all runs against other Vaishnava traditions that consider Krishna an avatar of Vishnu. Gaudiya interpretations and differences in opinion regarding this issue on how the attributes of God in general mentioned by the wider Vaishnava tradition that informs Gaudiya thought apply to Krishna leaves some ambiguity in the tradition's interpretation regarding PBT. So that's why you find a lot of different references trying to hedge this idea that Krishna is the absolute, the source of everything, even though other texts will generally mention other things. So this creates a problem of how do you apply perfect being theism here, in a sense. You could take the traditional view, but because it is kind of very, how can you call it, like the fog of trying to explain all this in a Gaudiya Vaishnava sense, it becomes difficult to actually create consistency across the theory. Because it is part of the traditional understanding of God. You can't isolate it from it. The third one, personal experience. Our personal experiences of prayer, spiritual experiences, or encounters with the world might shape our understanding of God, Krishna, or Chaitanya. A formal PBT-derived concept of God would seem distant or impersonal, whereas personal experiences suggest a God who is close and actively involved in life. Hence, an understanding of PBT might need to be reconsidered in terms of how it applies to one's own life. CC is full of descriptions of different devotees expressing their personal experiences of Chaitanya. They offer multifaceted perspective on Chaitanya's divinity that doesn't necessarily gel with a singular perspective offered by PBT. So as a kind of initial thought on a conclusion, because this is not really fully fleshed out, just trying to think through it, on applying PBT to the concept of Chaitanya. PBT is more or less okay when applied to Chaitanya, insofar as it is analyzed by Krishna, that Chaitanya is non-different with Krishna as God with his divine properties, which are somewhat consistent with omniscience through to aseity. However, perfect being theism is deficient as a model for Chaitanya when it comes to the characteristics that uniquely define Chaitanya in scripture, tradition, and personal testimonies, and also including what comes out of the CC and how God is explained through that. There's different forms, whether a devotee and so on and so forth, teacher, and the madman part of it as well. Anyway, so moving on to panentheism, have a quick look at that. As we know, panentheism is an attempt to find a happy medium for the positive aspects of the polar claims of transcendence and immanence. Very simply stated, it posits that God is greater than the universe, transcending in both being and power, and yet the universe is also somehow in God. Although the in is interpreted in different ways, in general, panentheism explores the dynamic interplay between the divine and the cosmos, suggesting that God is somehow involved in and in some cases potentially affected by the world, while also existing as that being that consciously sustains or guides it. There are possible claims to panentheism in CC. I've listed a couple there. We could also pass these different expressions in CC into different kinds of panentheism. For example, we could apply what is often called classical panentheism, which is an attempt to integrate ideas of transcendence and immanence with more traditional theistic concepts from classical theism, while often placing more emphasis on God's transcendence rather than immanence, right? So the in is interpreted in different ways, but in general, that's the general idea. So CC offers the second one, offers some ways to kind of look at that. The idea offered in CC is that God is within the world, but that the world is not within God. And CC also regularly emphasizes the transcendent aspect of Chaitanya as Krishna himself. so as to not allow the readers to lose track of Chaitanya's divinity while reading and engaging with a highly personal and very human narrative of Chaitanya in the text. So there's a constant reminder going on because it just looks like you're reading just an ordinary person going on. However, this view on panentheism is too formal and structured to be any relevance in defining the unique concept of Chaitanya as Radha, Krishna, the best devotee, etc., that was listed before. Two, on what I would term Eastern panentheism. This is a set of ideas found especially in Ramanuja's Vishishta Vedanta, in certain interpretations of the Kabbalah, and Ibn Sina and others. The core idea is that God's relation with the world can be defined in terms of emanations, interconnectedness, or that the world is a kind of manifestation of God. The specific ways this is articulated tend to greatly vary across traditions. I would say that the closest version to the Gaudiya concept in these terms, at least in terms of proximity of theology, geography, and influence, is Ramanuja, who uses the analogy of the self and body to describe God or Narayan and the world. Just as the self is the animating principle of the body, God is the sustaining and animating principle of the universe. CC follows the Gaudiya scheme in describing a relation between God and the world, which is that the world and its inhabitants are different kinds of Shakti, God's power, potency, and its energy. Me and Ricardo, we wrote a chapter together in our Routledge volume, Vaishnava Concepts of God, about Shakti. I'm trying to do a topology of Shakti because it's a very, very complex, there's lots of different types of Shaktis, but they're all merged into just three kinds, basically. So we did it, but for here, I won't go into it. You can read it if you like. The world as the extrinsic Shakti of God does emanate from God, but not in a direct way. I can explain that if you want to in the questions, but not a direct way. There are intermediary beings, Maya Devi, for instance, that do the creative and maintaining work of the universe, the physical universe. So allow distance between, on the one hand, the purity, eternality, and full knowledge of God, and on the other hand, the profanity, temporariness, and ignorance contained in the world. Ramanuja's body-soul analogy would be too intimate for Gaudiyas, I think, even though they do acknowledge it, and also a monist aspect to God. It's their ontological position known as beta-beta. Beta meaning difference and beta non-difference. They also, I won't go into that, Ricardo will give us something on that. They also constantly reinforce the idea of God's transcendence as well, on top of that. That's the Gaudiyas. They do, however, accept the idea of Antirami, which they call Paramatma, as an expansion or aspect of Bhagavan Krishna, who is tasked with accompanying each individual self or soul that is contained within. Right? So it's an accompanying soul, great soul, Paramatma, the great soul, in the material world, but it doesn't continue to accompany souls when they leave the material world. And it acts as a witness and sanctions our act in the world. Krishnadas in CC uses a different analogy to that Ramanuja to express Paramatma's connection in the world, specifically with its inhabitants, which he cites from Bhagavad Purana. As the one sun appears differently situated to different seers, so also do you, the unborn, appear differently represented as the Paramatma in every living being. We could claim a kind of panentheism here, but it would have to be tied with a strong concept of personalism as well. Finally, if I can do this, we'll just, thank you. So we have, I talked about process panentheism that's influenced by Whitehead. Whitehead's process philosophy and developed by Hartshorne. The core ideas of process panentheism is that God is dipolar, possessing both primordial or unchanging nature and consequent and changing nature, two natures. On the latter nature, God interacts dynamically with the world, experiencing its joys and sorrows. So in process panentheism, emphasis is placed on process, rationality, creaturely freedom, as well as on God's temporality and persuasive power. In CC, Chaitanya is Krishna who wants to experience Radha's love for him. Though this is expressed as a strictly spiritual relation, experience, and process, it occurs within the material realm. So there is something to this realm that facilitates it. However, it would be a stretch to claim that Chaitanya is interacting with the worldly. So what is the in process panentheism that can apply to Chaitanya in the world? So on process panentheism, the world isn't simply placed in God. It is constitutive of God's experience. It is constantly being shaped and influenced by God's persuasive love. Similarly, God's consequent nature is being constantly enriched and affected by the world's processes, events, and experiences, including joys, sorrows, struggles, triumphs, so on and so forth. These become parts of God's own being and experience. Although there are elements of this view that resonate with the God of Prema Bhakti and the best of devotees, i.e. Chaitanya, it is problematic on the CC's constant appeals to God's transcendence. So there is this dual nature, sure, but at the same time, to claim that God is affected by the world becomes a little problematic for them as well. It's because God's interactions with the world are with his own energies. So it's basically, Chaitanya doesn't appear by himself. He appears with his entourage. He appears with everyone, spiritual beings, just like Krishna does, and he interacts with them. And his interactions with everyone who isn't as spiritual beings are more on level of teaching and that kind of thing. So there is this complexity to his ascent, his coming to the world. So how about God's enabling and empowering presence in the world? On this angle, the world is in God because God provides the initial aims or possibilities for each moment of existence, each actual occasion. God's presence is not coercive or deterministic, but rather persuasive and enabling. He offers possibilities and lures the world towards greater value and complexity. So it's not about control, but about empowerment. This angle is encouraging, but it should be also acknowledged that Paramatma has many roles. And one of the roles that Paramatma has is, as a manifestation of God, is to enable sin, to enable people to sin. It's part of his, sanctioning power. So that's part of someone's karmic journey, just facilitates that. So it has to be taken into account as well. The in process panentheism also signifies the deep relationality between God and the world. They're not two separate entities, but are bound together in a dynamic and reciprocal relationship. The world is in God because God is in constant interaction and relationship with every aspect of creation. This includes the idea that all things are interconnected with each other and the relationships are grounded in God's overarching relatedness to the world. This has echoes of Beta Beta in it, so it's a possibility there as well. Some final thoughts on panentheism. I'll finish now. So there are other versions of panentheism that I could have engaged, but I needed to keep this to the allotted time. So I haven't even done that, have I? So in general, panentheism focuses on the relation between God and world. Although part of Chaitanya's advent is due with liberating as many of those souls as possible who are traversing the world in their mortal coils, whether they're doing so morally or immorally, that's another issue. There is also an essential aspect of Chaitanya's godhood that is about the interplay between God and his various intrinsic energies. Hence, Chaitanya's God, even without the cosmos, is a highly relational being, which begs the question of whether we need to address his being in the material cosmos as essential to his concept. So overall, finally, one small little thing. The least jarring of the angles explained in the above attempt to apply versions of PBT and panentheism to the concept of Chaitanya is that of relationality. I'm not for cherry picking aspects from each model and then duct taping them together to form a concept of Chaitanya as God. I think that would end up more confusing than helpful. So on this initial survey I performed, I would hazard an exclusively relational concept of God that takes account of the eternal relationship between Radha and Krishna as combined in Chaitanya and between Chaitanya and his Shaktis, especially his close associates and also the ordinary living beings, would yield a more coherent concept of Chaitanya as God than trying to map a more formal concept of God. So thank you.